Welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Tonight's guest has a powerful story. It's personal and at times troubling. It has made headlines in the media, and it's been transformational, leading to a conviction and cultural and institutional recommendations regarding sexual abuse cases. Sexual abuse, assault, and rape are vastly underreported. For many reasons, victims feel fear, shame, and reprisal. For the cases that do get reported and lead to charges, chances of conviction are very low. Dr. Julie Mcfarland, a professor of law emerita at the University of Windsor, understands the legal obstacles, but her perspective from a victim and activist point of view provides prodigious insight and clarity as to why institutions resort, in her words, to a bias of skepticism, dismissal, and disbelief. In the 1960s, 5-year-old Julie experienced sexual assault when a teenager attacked her in the woods near her home on the Isle of Wight. Just over a decade later, she suffered sustained sexual abuse by an Anglican church minister. While attending university, she was date raped. In her 20s, she endured physical violence at the hands of a partner, fleeing from him in the middle of the night. Julie's book, Going Public, recounts all of these horrors. Her story may make you feel sad, shocked, angry, and frustrated, but it will also inspire hope. And more recently, her activism is prompting the world to examine NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. Julie, welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm delighted you're here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, what was the catalyst that actually prompted you to write this book decades after having endured so much abuse?
Well, as you know from reading the book, it describes my decision, which was actually, I was just thinking almost exactly 8 years ago now, to become public about my own experience as a survivor of rape and sexual assault in my school, in my law school at the University of Windsor. And I did that because I was increasingly being drawn to do work that related to the way that the legal system treats victims of sexual violence. And I felt like it was time for me to come out to these students. And I thought it would help to empower those who were also had been in similar situations. So the decision to come out then spawned a lot of other things. And I reached a point a couple of years ago when I felt that part of my recovery would be to write this down, to write down what had happened to me, to write down my decision to become public, and then the sort of primary events which had taken place by that point. I think my publisher has suggested several times there needs to be a part 2 here, but we'll see.
There's so much to talk about. But while you were writing this book, you were fighting cancer and dealing with the civil and criminal proceedings against the minister. How on earth did you find the courage and stamina to write a book? I mean, I know what it's like to write a book when you're really healthy and strong.
Well, I consider myself extremely fortunate that for me, my whole life, writing has been my happy place. And that means I have a place that I can go where I know I will be happy, and that's writing. And, you know, even in those woods, which were the scene of my childhood assault and, you know, all of those horrible memories, those woods before then had been somewhere I dragged my tiny little desk and chair and set it up. And I was in my office writing. I don't think I could write at the time, but anyway. So it was a very cathartic experience. It was at times re-traumatizing to do this. But what was really interesting to me was which parts were the hardest to write. And they weren't the parts that I had expected. The part that was the hardest to write was the part which is the most recent, other than the criminal trial, which talks about what happened at the university when they gave a non-disclosure agreement to a colleague of mine. And I was then sued for telling the truth about what had happened to him. That's the one that still is the most upsetting.
Did that come from a sense of betrayal by your own institution?
Yes, by my institution, certainly. I mean, more the idea, I think, of universities, because I have spent 40 years in universities and I have always believed them to be these wonderful, important, progressive places. And I don't feel quite the same way any longer. But it was also a sense of abandonment, really, by colleagues and by people around me who weren't willing to stand with me.
That's a terrible place to have to be, isn't it?
It's very, very lonely. And I think, it's lonely being a survivor of sexual violence who hasn't disclosed as well. That's another kind of loneliness. But I think the loneliness that is the hardest is that people experience when they do stand up and disclose or call out something or they whistle blow something, and then they feel abandoned, because that's a really hard kind of loneliness.
How have people responded, people outside your family and your family, to your book?
And my children have been absolutely amazing. I mean, I did say, I can imagine this might not be your favorite to have your mother do this, but they have all been incredibly supportive and encouraging of me. I think they're very patient with me about that, but they've been great. So, that was great. That was fine. It was far more difficult to tell colleagues, friends, people I'd worked with for years who had never had any sense that this was happening. And of course, there were people I felt should know before they read it. Mm-hmm. So.
Do you think that the book has helped those who were not there for you? Do you think that it's made them ashamed?
No, I think they probably haven't read it.
Well, most the pity.
But no, trying to broaden this a little bit, Veronique, just to be fair. I think that one of the things that I have learned through my experience here in Windsor, but subsequently my experience of working with people in other universities in Canada on similar issues around how we deal with sexual misconduct by students and by faculty and by staff, by everybody. What I have learned from doing that, and now the work for the Can't Buy My Silence campaign, is that, universities are places where people really kind of like to keep their heads down. And, they would rather not rock the boat if it might have some future consequence. And so people prefer to sort of keep it on the down and low.
So it's protect the institution.
And oneself within the institution. And, I don't know. I just could never get that much in love with an institution that I would say it's okay for you to lie about someone that is a predator and send them to another university. I can't get that much in love with any institution. Yeah. That's okay.
Now, the #MeToo movement, this really did bring a lot of attention to sexual abuse.
Yeah.
What did you think of it? And do you think that it has made a difference?
Oh, I think undoubtedly it's made a huge difference. And I think that maybe the most important way it's made a difference is that we're having conversations which, have the anchor #MeToo, but we are having more and more of those conversations, undoubtedly. But the irony, I think, about the Me Too movement is that it has encouraged more people to step forward and disclose and report. And what the work I'm doing now, faces me with all the time is the inadequacy. In fact, the bias and the unfairness of so many of those systems that are supposed to then deal with what comes next, So we have so much more work to do than just reporting sexual violence and sexual harassment and misconduct, we have to figure out how then we support people who report, that we don't put them into a process that continuously re-traumatizes them over and over again. And we don't put them into a process in which they're often asked then at the end to agree not to talk about this to anybody ever again, which is the non-disclosure agreement.
Yes, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But as you were talking, I was thinking, do you ever get frustrated that in 2022 that we have to have this conversation?
Oh my, don't get me started. I mean, you know, one of the things that does sometimes make me sad is that when my oldest daughter, who has just had her first child.
Congratulations.
Thank you. When she was a baby, and there's a little bit of her story in the book too, because I was a single mom with her. When she was a baby, I used to look at her and think, it won't be like this for you. I mean, it was something I can remember actually thinking about. And then her younger sister, and then her younger sister, with each of them, I've thought, no, by the time, you know, you're all grown up and going to work, it'll be different. But it isn't. No. So yeah, that does make me very frustrated.
In the book, you talk about rape myths. Could you explain that? And also, do you see them diminishing in the light of this Me Too movement?
Well, rape myth is the idea that we have so many assumptions that we've been socialized into about what happens when a woman is raped, that distorts how we see things. And, you know, there's a sort of the overarching idea is that we diminish, you know, we disbelieve allegations of rape, or we displace the blame for that onto the victim, onto the woman. You know, her skirt was too short, she shouldn't have been out late at night, etc. I think that one of the things that Me Too has done it has really educated a lot of people on some of what I would call, you know, sexism 101, which is that, you know, displacing the blame from a male assailant to a female victim, you know, is a little unfair, and sort of sensitizing them to some of those stereotypes, you know. And I think there's been a lot more discussion about consent, you know, and that it has to be a thing, not just something you thought was happening. So I think there has been some good education. But the real problem, I think, is that, you know, there's still so many ways deep in the culture that all of this happens over and over and over again. And I don't feel like we've really got to the point yet of normalizing the conversations we have so that we can have more and more and more of those conversations. There's still so much squeamishness, and we need to talk more.
And of course, even though sometimes it seems that the guy is going to be, you know, charged dead nuts, and then we have a proceeding like the Jian Ghomeshi. What are your thoughts? And what was going through your mind when you were watching that?
I mean, I think along with, you know, hundreds of thousands of other women in Ontario, you know, that was a period of absolute agony those weeks. And I did write quite a bit about it, partway through and then at the end. I mean, it felt like a complete betrayal by, you know, what at that point I was still prepared to believe might be sometimes a system capable of delivering a just outcome. You know, the idea that we have reduced some of the sort of adversarialism of these, you know, proceedings. We're trying to establish truth. And the way that we do it now is to allow a lawyer to beat up a woman about every single minute detail of her recollection. You know, I often say, this is a bit like saying, you know, I ran out of my burning house 3 years ago, and somebody says, and what color were your socks? I mean, you know, these are ridiculous. And I've been through this process, as I describe in my book, twice now, being cross-examined in a criminal trial. And it's just ridiculous. It's ludicrous. So we're never really going to get to a place in which we can find truth if we're still using those kinds of arcane processes.
And today, people know that, I mean, all kinds of experts tell us that in a PTSD situation where you're traumatized, you don't have total recall. I certainly don't have total recall from last Tuesday. And so if you're in a sexual assault, you know, it must be really agonizing for women like yourself to have to realize that you'll be badgered into sometimes saying one or two words that didn't match up.
Yeah. And, you know, this is one of the things that I could never get over. I came into this, Veronique, as the most privileged possible person. I mean, if you're going to force somebody through the miserable experience of being the complainant in a criminal trial for sexual abuse, then, you know, pick a law professor, because at least they'll have, you know, studied it and have some vague idea of what's going on. And, you know, we'll have a job to go back to when it's all over, and et cetera, et cetera. Yet this was so impossibly difficult.
Do you ever look in the mirror and say, I'm a law professor? How could this have happened?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, it's an equal opportunity, you know, destroyer of people, this system. But this whole idea that credibility has to hang on such minute details, and that people are kind of being invited to tear down, which is what happened with Young Ghomeshi, of course, and it was done very effectively. People are invited to tear someone down. It's not about establishing the truth. It's just a horrible system.
Do you ever think that there'll be a time when it's not normal?
Yes, because I'm an optimist. I'm a great optimist. I would have to be an optimist, really, if you read my story. But I am a great optimist. And I do believe it will. I don't think that we're going to go on seeing this kind of witness whacking we've just been talking about, as it's sometimes
It's quite
called.
egregious, isn't it?
Yes, and I don't think we're going to go on seeing this forever. I mean, I don't like the way some of the debate's going, but I really don't believe we'll see it forever. And I also think that increasingly the voices of survivors are having some impact on the way that people think about the criminal justice system. I actually feel less optimism for the civil system, where I also went through that experience. And of course, it's the civil system that we're seeing producing all of these horrifyingly exploitative settlements, which then bind victims to silence forever.
I'm going to talk about that in 1 second, but just very briefly, you mentioned what had happened at the university, which of course will lead into this the NDA, and when a former employee moved to Trinidad,
right,
and a Trinidadian court found you to have defamed him.
I defamed him.
What advice would you give to another woman in that sort of a situation? I mean, really, it's mind-blowing.
What advice would I give? Well, probably go hide under the bed with the rest of your colleagues. But I didn't. Because, I mean, the truth of the matter is what led to that is something I can't possibly regret and never regret for a second, which was telling the truth to somebody about what had happened. What was it? What was it like? It was surreal. It was honestly surreal. And I mean, again, my privilege was very useful and important because I know there's not a reciprocal jurisdiction between Ontario and Trinidad. So I knew I couldn't actually be dragged in chains to Trinidad and imprisoned, although I might avoid going there on holidays, I think, in the future. Kidding. But I mean, the basic story was that the university, represented by its insurer, put no evidence into court. So they put in no evidence of his termination, for example, his letter of termination, which I now have, no evidence of the agreement they made with him, including the non-disclosure agreement, which I now have, and no evidence of the letter of recommendation they gave him, as well as the letter of termination for harassment.
It's, it leaves one speechless, doesn't it?
It's pretty amazing,
Now,
really.
just recently, Prince Andrew managed to get an NDA. Were you surprised?
Not at all, because, they are par for the course. But I mean, we don't know, actually. I mean, she signed an NDA with Jeffrey Epstein. We don't know that Virginia Giuffre signed an NDA with Prince Andrew. So I'm still, unless I've missed a report somewhere. So I don't think that she signed an NDA with him. Certainly there was a lot of pressure on her not to.
Will be interesting to see how that all washes out.
It will be, yes.
And if she did, it'll be interesting to see if it ever gets broken, because I think women are getting to a point where
they're just going to stand up and break them.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
Now, of course, you're working, speaking of Harvey Weinstein, you're now working with... They're all alike, aren't they? Zelda Perkins, who once worked for Harvey Weinstein. Tell us about that, what you're doing.
Well, Zelda has been working for years, about 4 years by the time I met her, she broke her NDA with Weinstein. She was the first woman to do that. And she spent the next 4 years trying to persuade the British government to legislate to ban NDAs. And, the short version of the outcome of that was, having been extraordinarily effective, the government changed hands from Theresa May to Boris Johnson, and everything went to hell in a handbasket. So the work that had been put into that just kind of came to a halt. So when I met Zelda, which I did on Twitter, she was actually, sort of still exhausted from all of that work, but not feeling like, she was about to leap into this again, having had such a disappointing outcome there. And so we started to talk to one another, and within a very short time, we had decided she was ready to jump back in again. I really wanted to work on banning non-disclosure agreements, and we became a team.
And can'tbuymysilence.com was created.
That's right.
And in this country, the province of Prince Edward Island, on May 17th, we'll bring that
law into effect. Yes.
Do you have hope for the rest of the country?
Oh my goodness, yes. So the campaign was launched in September in the UK and Canada. I'm the Canadian arm. Zelda is the UK arm, obviously. And we have actually legislation also going through in Ireland. I helped to write this legislation originally with the Irish team. Prince Edward Island and Lynn Lunn's team, they got it passed in the fall. It comes into effect in May, and it will ban the use of non-disclosure agreements to cover up misconduct, discrimination, and harassment. So really exciting.
And a very nicely sort of broad legislation, because it doesn't just look at sexual harassment.
No, not just sexual harassment. Yes. Exactly. And that's really important, Veronique, because we've seen it being used so often to bury racial discrimination, other kinds of bullying, and so on and so forth. And now we have, in the next couple of weeks, Manitoba will file its legislation, and also sometime in the next few weeks, Nova Scotia's opposition will file legislation. So British Columbia are exploring this, looking at it very seriously. So we have lots happening.
That's absolutely wonderful. What advice do you have for women who want to come forward but know all the pitfalls?
I would advise them to find good support, make sure there is somebody that they can talk to, and that person knows this is not going to be an easy gig. It's, they're really going to need to support them. And then, take it step at a time, because disclosing isn't the same as reporting. You can disclose, you might want to talk about something that's happened to you with people around you, but not necessarily make an actual complaint. I would say that, we have to keep pushing on systems to respond to women. I wouldn't want to push any woman into reporting because of how difficult it is to go through a workplace process or a university process or a criminal process. But that is the way we're going to make the system change as well. But begin with your support people and begin just by making yourself comfortable talking about it.
Julie, is there a passage in the book that you think is really important for you to tell people?
Well, I'm just going to read a little bit from the part of the book that's about what I think we need to change big time in the legal system. I write this: lawyers on both sides, as well as judges who work on sexual violence cases, need to be far better educated on sexual abuse-related trauma. This type of training is still virtually unknown inside the legal profession, despite growing numbers of available educational resources. We also need a registry of lawyers willing to work with complainants on a contingency or pro bono basis so more women are able to bring forward civil claims of sexual abuse and harassment. The legal profession, which carries both power and responsibility in relation to justice for the victims of sexual violence, needs to do much, much better.
Should this be part of what young girls need to hear? Because I've heard, it's not unusual for young girls to put up with an abusive boyfriend.
Right. Well, I mean, the same dynamics, as we were saying a little while ago, the same dynamics are still there in the culture as they were, when I was much younger. But I think that we've enabled younger women to have a conversation far richer than we were able to in our generation. I'm not sure that conversation yet really has a vocabulary, though, for talking about violence. I think there's certainly a vocabulary in there for talking about harassment and bullying increasingly, but whether it's really there yet for, actual violence and threats, and I hope it is, because every young woman needs to be able to have that conversation with others.
Well, Julie Mcfarland, you're one courageous woman. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Scribes and Songsters. Many thanks to our guest, Julie Mcfarland. Thanks to our Scribes and Songsters team, producer Liz Pettypiece-Phillips, technical producer and editor Gary Glass, social media manager Michelle Fortier, and consultant Brian Sweet. Grateful thanks to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation, and to Neil and Tina Queering for their support. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you soon, right back here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Bye for now.